In the space of about 5 minutes that I have, I don't think I can really do justice to the global and the local context of the temporary foreign worker issue. I would suggest to you that there are a couple of recent publications which will give you a much better global and local context. One is produced by the West Coast Domestic Workers Association, a report called Access to Justice that was issued last year. And it provides, I think, a pretty good overview of both the global and the local context for the temporary foreign worker program. I also am the co-chair of the BC Employment Standards Coalition, which has been campaigning for the past 4 years around the issues of improvement in the Employment Standards Act and the provincial, and in particular the provincial government's responsibility to regulate and protect workers, particularly temporary foreign workers, which it currently is not doing. And so it's my submission that the temporary foreign worker issue is not just a federal government issue, it's also a provincial government issue and requires action by the provincial government to provide protections and enforcement of the rights of temporary foreign workers in the same way in which ordinary Canadian workers should be protected. But that requires, as I will elaborate later, that requires some specific legislation and changes to the law and changes to the way in which the Employment Standards Act is enforced. Anyhow, just getting back to kind of the global and the local context, this report of the West Coast Domestic Workers notes that since the turn of this century, the 21st century, Canada has moved increasingly to an immigration model that prioritizes the import of temporary foreign workers, and that this is consistent with a global trend toward heavy reliance on the import of temporary labor among developed countries of the North, particularly the 32 countries that belong to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. About 2.5 million temporary workers actually entered the OECD countries in 2006, the latest information we have. And that's about 3 times the number of workers who entered on a permanent basis. So the ratio of temporary entries into the developed countries from the global south is 3 times that now. The temporary entries are 3 times that of the permanent entries. An important characteristic of the temporary foreign worker program in most of these countries, including Canada, is that governments have handed over to employers in search of low-cost and just-in-time flexible labor the power to actually decide who enters to Canada, who comes to Canada. There's what I would characterize as a contracting out of immigration to employers. Employers decide, and also in some cases the governments of the sending countries are the deciders as to who comes to Canada, and really not Citizenship and Immigration Canada. Well, at the same time, these governments have actually abandoned policies, macroeconomic policies, macro-employment policies that address the issues of full-time employment for Canadian workers. And this I think, is at the background of this tension between increasing influx of temporary foreign workers and the abandonment of programs to provide employment to Canadians. At the same time, of course, in the home countries of the temporary foreign workers, with growing and burgeoning poverty and unemployment, these conditions are being addressed by many governments who actually are promoting the export of labor themselves, so as to make remittances a major component of their exports. That is the return of monies from the temporary foreign workers to their home countries. So this is also part and parcel of a global policy of reliance on temporary work as opposed to permanent work, and to address poverty and unemployment in the countries of the South. In Canada, the federal Tory government budgets and economic action plans have built into them for a number of years in the past, the temporary farm worker program. For example, the economic action plan for 2014 states that in 2014 the federal budget commits to spend $11 million over 2 years and $3.5 million per year thereafter to strengthen the labor market opinion process, that is the labor market opinion process for the temporary farm worker program. And this is on the pretext of ensuring that Canadians are given the first choice of available jobs. So as we know, in the past period of time, there's been an uproar over the displacement of Canadian workers by temporary farm workers and the total failure of the program and the way in which it's administered to acknowledge that Canadian workers are being replaced in some sectors by temporary farm workers. There are two types of statistics that are reported by the federal government with respect to temporary farm workers. The number of temporary farm workers present as of December in each year and the total number of temporary farm worker entries in each year is published by Citizenship and Immigration Canada. So there are two agencies that are actually keeping statistics, and they don't marry up very well. So Citizenship and Immigration maintain a database of entries and how many are in the country. And then the second kind of data is produced by what is now called Employment and Social Development Canada. Used to be HRDC, Human Resources and Skills Development, now renamed Employment and Social Development. And they maintain a database on temporary farm worker who are on what they call positive labor market opinions. And so this is the number of temporary farm workers that have actually been approved to come to Canada on temporary work permits. And there's been some reference to the statistics, but according to the CIC statistics, the number of temporary farm workers present in Canada as of December the 1st in each year increased from 109,667 in 2003 to 338,000 in 2012, an increase of 208%. In BC, the number, and in BC has about 22% of that total number. In BC, the number increased from 22,204 in 2003 to 74,219 in 2012. That's the last year they published annual statistics. That represents an increase of 234% in the number of temporary farm workers that are actually present in the country. And some temporary farm workers come here under short-term programs, such as the SOP, which is a maximum of 8 months. Others come under 2-year programs, right? So some may be here and some may be... The SOP program typically ends in December, I believe. The return home under the SOP program is typically in December. So the number as of December is probably going to be mostly those temporary farm workers who are here under a 2-year program. So also according to the CIC statistics, the total number of temporary farm workers that entered Canada in each year increased from 103,000 in 2003 to 213,500 in 2012, an increase of 108%. And in BC, that number, the number of actual entries in the year went from 20,500 in 2003 to 49,000 entries in 2012. So those are new entries, right? There's the stock, how many are here, and then there's those that come in during the year. Now, according to the Employment and Social Development Canada statistics for 2012, the number of temporary farm workers admitted on the basis of a positive labor market opinion was led by agricultural workers. Agricultural workers are the largest component of the temporary farm worker program. In Canada as a whole, there were 38,590. They were followed by the food service workers, and this is the new phenomenon, is the food service workers actually have displaced the living caregivers as being the second largest group. And in 2012, there were 36,000 food service workers, or temporary farm workers in the food service sector. And then live-in caregivers were 16,500. In BC, those numbers were that out of a total of 16,325 that were admitted under positive labour market opinions, the largest number of positive NMOs were for temporary farm workers that work in the agricultural sector, which was 5,400, followed by food service workers at 3,400, and then living caregivers at 3,390. So the SOP program, which started in Ontario in 1966, there's now about 30,000 of SOP workers in 8 provinces across Canada. The SOP in BC was started in 2004. Before 2004, there were no SOP workers in BC, but due to tremendous pressure from the agricultural sector, particularly in the Fraser Valley, the provincial government, the Liberal government, entered into the SOP program, and they went from 47 workers in 2004 to 5,000 workers in 2012. Then if we add in, there's also the agricultural stream program, which also covers, and it's a 2-year program of low-skilled for agricultural workers. So if you add those into the numbers, we have over 6,000 temporary farm workers working in agriculture in BC in 2012. The Living Caregiver Program, which started in 1992, there actually were 3,400 in 2012 that came in under labour market opinions. This is down from a peak of 7,315 in 2008, and I think the explanation for that is the decline in the economy. Clearly, the rapid decline in the number of living caregivers that came into BC after 2008, down to now less than half of what it was in 2008.
Thank you, David.
Okay.